we had already developed a full-fledged REST API server using Express and MongoDB as part of this course. In order for that server to be able to communicate meaningfully with our client, we will make a few minor adjustments to it so that it returns the right kind of data so that our client implementation can work more efficiently with the data returned from our server side. So to do that, let's work on a few adjustments to our server side in this exercise. Before you start this exercise, I am assuming that you have not done the previous lesson on integrating the Angular client and the server, because you are doing this lesson coming through the React specialization. And so the changes that I will make to the server will assume that the version of the server that you're modifying is before the previous lesson. In case you have done the lesson on Angular client, some of the changes that you have done to your server will be repeated again in this exercise. So you can skip over that part of the changes. Going to our server in the editor, before we start working on the server, I would suggest that you download all the images that I have provided as a zip file in the exercise resources called images.zip, unzip the file, and then obtain all the images from there, and then copy those images into the public images folder in our server. So you see that here I have copied all the images into my public images folder here already, because our server is the one that is going to serve up all these images for our client application. Next, we go to the course and adjust the whitelist here. So for our React client application, if we start it up with the yarn start command, it runs at your computer name :3001. So any requests coming in from our application to the server will carry that as the origin there. So that is why I'm going to add that into my whitelist so that any course problems will be addressed automatically. So going into the course.js file in my whitelist here, let me add in the http:// my computer's name :3001. And this is the origin from which my client will be originating the requests that come to this server. So that way, my course would not cause problems for my client. Next, we need to update a few of the routes to handle the query parameters and also a few minor other adjustments. Let me start with the promo-router.js file. So that is simple to get updated. So going to the promo-router.js file, in the promo-router file, for the get requests that we get here, instead of doing promotions find with an empty JavaScript object, here I would supply the rec.query as the parameter to the promotions find here. Same thing with the leader router also. So let me go to the leader router.js file, and in the leader router also, here where you find leaders find with the empty JavaScript object, instead replace that with the rec.query so that the query parameters will be passed in. So this is where we will pass in the featured :true as the query parameter here. Now, having adjusted these two, let's now work on the dish router. So going to dishrouter.js file, even in the dish router also, the same update here. So going to this dishes find in the get method here, change that to rec.query. So with this, my dish router update has been completed. So we have now updated the promo router, the leader router, and the dish router. Then we will move on to update the favorite router. Now, you would have implemented the favorite router as part of your fourth assignment. Now, in the favorite router, we will see that for the favorite router, I'm not showing you the remaining part because that you should have done as part of your assignment. let me draw your attention to the get method for the favorite router route :dish ID. Now I'm going to use this get method to just check to ensure that the specific dish with the dish ID is already a favorite for the user. So instead of simply saying get operation not supported, I am just going to leverage the presence of this get operation, and then we'll say favorites find one, and we'll say user rec.user.id. So we will find the favorites for that particular user, and then we'll say then favorites and catch error next error. And then similarly here we will add in the error here, next error here. So inside this, then when we get the favorites, then we will check if not favorites. So if there are no favorites for this user, then obviously the dish that we are checking for doesn't exist. So we'll return res status code 200 set header content type application JSON. So, and then we'll return saying exists false. So what we are specifying here is that if the get is done to this endpoint with a dish ID, this exists flag here will be set to true if this dish is part of my favorites. If this dish is not part of my favorites, I will set the exists flag to false. So here you see that since I don't have any favorites, so exists should be automatically false at this point. So we'll say exists false, and then we will return the favorites here. Well, obviously in this case the favorites would be null at this point. Otherwise, so which means that favorites is not null. So we'll say if favorites dot dishes index of. So we are going to be searching for rec params dish ID. So we're going to search this favorites dishes array to see if this dish exists in there. And if it doesn't exist, obviously this will return a negative index here. So in that case also, I will return exactly the same as here. So if it returns a negative index, then that means that even though this particular user has a set of favorites, this specific dish doesn't exist in the list of his or her favorites. So that's why I'll return exists false here. Now, otherwise, that means that the dish exists in the list of favorites. So in this case, I will return status code 200 exists is true. So that way, when the user performs a get operation on this endpoint with the /favorites/dish ID, where the dish ID is supplied as the parameter here, as the request parameter here, then we will check to see whether that dish exists in the favorites. If none of the favorites exist for this user, then we'll return an exists false. Similarly, if the favorites exist, but that particular dish doesn't exist in the favorites, then we'll return a false. Otherwise, we will return a true. So this exists flag can be used by my client to check to see if this dish is part of the list of dishes, favorite dishes for this user or not. Also, while we are in favorites, whenever we make any changes to the favorites, we want to be able to populate the user and dishes information in the favorites before we return. So, for example, in the post that we do, when we save the favorites, then at this point, we would like to first do favorites find by ID. So because we just made the changes, so we'll say favorite underscore ID, and we'll populate both the user and also populate the dishes in the favorites. Then when the favorites is returned, then we'll return that favorites instead. So let me make this change here. So we will cut this out from here, and then inside the then we'll return the favorite. So we're going to be, after we save the favorites, then we'll search for it, for the favorite by ID, and then return that favorite here. So we'll say then favorite return and status code. So this change we should make. If you have already implemented this in your favorites, then you don't need to make this change. But what we are doing is whenever we make changes to the favorites, we'll populate both the user and dishes information and then return this value, because our React client expects this to be there. Now the same kind of change we will need to make wherever we save the changes. So in the post here, again here we'll make a change to that. So we'll say favorites save, and then we'll do favorites find by ID and make the change. Similarly, under the dish ID also in the post, you'll be similarly, whenever you make changes to the favorites, we'll first look for it and then populate both the user and dishes and then return it. And then similarly in the else part. So you must have implemented these in your fourth assignment. So make this additional change where you'll populate the user and dishes before you return the value. And also with the delete also, we'll do the same kind of changes here. So you notice that in the delete, I have already made this change here. So we'll, after we save the changes to the favorites, we'll then search for the favorites and then return after populating both the user and dishes in the favorites. This is what our React client expects us to do. So even for the delete, we'll do the same changes. Now with this, my favorite router is updated. So we'll proceed ahead to update users.js next. Finally, we'll update the users.js file. Now in the users.js file, we need to add in another router.options field here, because sometimes a post request, as you saw with the login, will send the options first to check, especially with cars, whether the post request will be allowed. So that's why we'll check cars with options here, and then we'll simply return a status message of 200 in response to that. So for any endpoint under users, if we receive the options, we'll simply return a status 200 here. Now the login function that we had implemented earlier, we had simply done passport authenticate local here, and then we checked for the remaining values here. Now this passport authenticate local, if the user doesn't get authenticated, it simply returns an unauthorized in the reply message. Now that may not be very meaningful for the client side to display this information. So that is why we will enhance this router post login method such that the authentication will return more meaningful information at this point. So to do that, we are not going to be doing the passport authenticate inside in here. Instead, we will take, so let me remove that from there, and then you will see how I will update the router post here. So we'll say cars with options, and then we'll include the rec, res, and next here. And inside this rec, res, and next here, passport authenticate, we'll call this with local. Now, when we call this with local, if a authentication error occurs, the passport authenticate can be made to return the error value, and also it will return the user if there is no error, and a third parameter called info, which will carry additional info that might be passed back to the user. This error will be returned when there is a genuine error that occurs in the passport authenticate. But if the user information is sent into passport authenticate, but the user doesn't exist, then that is not counted as an error. Instead, it will be counted as user doesn't exist. And that information is passed back in the info object that comes in. So the error will be returned when there is a genuine error that occurs during the authentication process, but the info will contain information if the user doesn't exist. And so the passport authenticate is passing back a message saying that the user doesn't exist, or either the username is incorrect or the password is incorrect, and so on. So that information will be passed in the info message. Now we will see how this is useful to us when we look at the client side a little bit later. So in this situation, we will handle this as follows. And not only that, when we call this passport authenticate, we also need to pass in a rec, res, next as the three parameters to it. So this is the structure when you need to call passport authenticate and expect it to pass you back information like this as a callback method here. So you also need to supply this rec, res, next right there too. Now, if this occurs, so we'll say if error. So if there is an error that occurs, we'll say return next error, and then let the error handler of our express router take care of that. Now, we'll consider other situations. If not user. So if we have reached this point, then that means that it was not an error that occurred, but instead perhaps the user could not be found. If the user is not found, then the user here will be set to null in this case. So in that situation, if the user doesn't exist, then we need to be able to pass information back to the server side. So what we will do is we will pass in this information in this format. So I'm going to cut this out from here and then paste it in here, and then we will edit this. So if the user is null, then we will send back a status code as 401, which means unauthorized, and then we will send back information success false, and then we'll not be passing back the token, we'll pass back the status message. So here we'll say login unsuccessful. And then the third information, we'll pass this info, that object that we received here, as the third part in the reply message that we send back from our server here. So the success flag will be set to false, the status will be set to login unsuccessful, and the error information that is passed in the info will be passed back. Now note that this situation will occur if either the username and the password is incorrect. And so this is not an error in the error sense, but the fact that the authenticate could not find either the user or the password of the user is incorrect. So that information will be encoded into the info that comes in, and so that I will pass back as an error to my client side. Otherwise, so the otherwise part is handled as rec.login. So if this is successful, the Passport Authenticate will add this method called rec.login to the user. So at this point, we will just simply pass in the user object that we obtained. So here, if we have reached this point, then that means that the user object is not null, and also no error occurred. So that means that the user can be logged in. And so we'll say error So we'll try to log in the user. So we'll say if error, and then we will pass back the same kind of error information that we did here. So in this case, if error, then we'll pass back a status code as 401, and we'll say success is false and status as login unsuccessful. And then the error information, we will pass this as, instead of the info, we'll pass in could not log in user. So that is the message that we'll pass back here. Okay, if the error occurs. Otherwise, we would be down below here. And so at this point, we would be able to generate the token. So if we have reached up to this point, that means that the user has successfully logged in, and so we can now generate the token. So we'll generate the token based upon the user's ID, and then we'll pass back the token back to the user. So here we will say var token, and then we can say res status code is 200, and then res JSON success true, so which means that the user successfully logged in, and so the status would be login successful. And then the third part, instead of the error, I will pass the token back to the user. So we'll say token, this token which we just obtained earlier. So that token will be passed in as the token property of the reply message. So here notice that the success is set to true, so which means that the user successfully logged in, and so the user can proceed forward at this point. And this has to be done inside the rec.login here. So at this point, we will close the rec.login. So notice that this is inside this rec.login here. So in there, we will pass these three back. So let me just indent these three lines in. And so that is how we would handle the user's login method. So again, reviewing this code one more time. So we'll do router post, but instead of doing Passport Authenticate right there, we will say rec res next, and then inside here we'll do a passport authenticate for the local, and this authenticate will pass back. So we can supply a callback function to that, and this callback function will return either the error, the user, or the info here. And so if it is an error, we'll just allow the express error handler to take care of that. If the user is null, then that means that the user login was unsuccessful, and the reason for that will be in the info, so that we will pass back as the info error in the reply message here. If we come up to this point, then the user is successfully verified, so then we will log in the user. So the passport authenticate will add in this method called login to the request message, so we can call the login with the user, and this, if this returns an error, then we will return the error here appropriately. If not, then we would have reached the point where the user is successfully authenticated, so we can generate the JSON Web Token here and then return the JSON Web Token to the user to confirm that the user is successfully logged in. So that is the set of steps that we're going to use here. Now, the reason why I do a more elaborate way of handling it is that I want to distinguish between the situation where a genuine error occurs during the authentication process, as opposed to the situation where the user name is invalid or the password is invalid. So those two cases will be handled by this situation, where the info will carry the information back to us. So that's not a error per se, but that's a situation where the user is not a valid user or the user's password is not valid. So that's how we will handle the user's login process. In addition, I will add in one more method here called check JWT token. It is quite possible that while the client has logged in and obtained the JSON Web Token, sometime later the JSON Web Token may expire. And so if the user tries to access from the client side with an expired token to the server, then the server will not be able to authenticate the user. So at periodic intervals, we may wish to cross-check to make sure that the JSON Web Token is still valid. So that is the reason why I am including this another endpoint called check JWT token. So if you do a get to the check JWT token by including the token into the authorization header, then this call will return a true or a false to indicate to you whether the JSON Web Token is still valid or not. If it is not valid, then the client side can initiate another login for the user to obtain a new JSON Web Token if required. So to do this, we'll say cars with options and rec res here as expected, and in here we will say passport authenticate JWT and session false, and this would return error user info. So recall how we used the passport authenticate earlier. So we called the JWT with session false here. So earlier here we said passport authenticate local. So this is for the local authentication. So this is for the JSON Web Token authentication. So when we call that, then since that is going to verify the JSON Web Token, so we'll say if error return next error, and then let the express error handler take care of that situation. And then we'll say if not user, if the user doesn't exist, then similarly else. So which means that if the user object was found from the JSON Web Token and then loaded onto the rec.user, then that means that the user is a valid user and so can be allowed to proceed forward. Otherwise, we're going to say that the user doesn't exist, so we need to infer that the JSON Web Token has expired. So at this point, we'll send a res with the status code of 401, so unauthorized, set header, content type, application JSON, and then we'll return res.json. We'll say status JWT invalid, and then we'll return a flag called success false, and then we'll return the info that we obtain if the user is not authenticated as the error at this point. Otherwise, that means that we reach this point, then the user is a valid user. So in this case, let me just copy that code here. We'll be sending a status code of 200, and then the res.json will send JWT valid, and success will be true. And the third part, we will send the user's information. So that way, when this endpoint is called with the get method, then this will verify whether the token is valid or not. If the token is valid, then you will receive this reply, and from the success flag in the reply, you can check to see whether the JSON Web Token is valid or not. And this is useful on the client side. Now this passport here, passport authenticate here, will have to be supplied with rec and res as the two parameters here. So that's how we call the passport authenticate. So notice that whenever you call passport authenticate and expect this callback function in here, you need to append this point rec.res to the passport authenticate at the back here. In our REST API server, we had implemented our comments in such a way that the comments formed subdocuments inside the dishes document. So thereby, every dish enclosed its own set of comments. But the way we implemented our React client is such that the comments were kept independent of the dishes, and the comments themselves carried the corresponding dish ID. Now, these are two different ways of implementing the server side as well as the client side. In the Angular application that we had implemented in our Angular specialization, we had used the subdocument method for handling comments in our Angular client application. So the REST API server was implemented in such a way that it was more suitable for the Angular client. But for the React client, since we kept the comments independent of the dishes and then use the dish ID inside the comment, so we need to restructure our REST API server such that we have a separate comment endpoint independent of the dishes endpoint. So we need to restructure our code in the server to introduce the /comments REST API endpoint at this stage. So to do that, let's go ahead and implement a new model called as comment.js. So going into the models, let me implement a new file named comments.js. And in the comments.js file, we're going to move the comment schema from the dishes.js file into the comments.js file and then remove it completely from the dishes.js file. But before we do that, we need to copy the Mongoose and the schema from here. So let me just copy these from dishes.js into comments.js. And then after that, going into dishes.js, let me cut this comment schema completely out from here, because we will be having this separately in the comments model here. So let's move that into the comments model and then paste it in here. But of course, this is not the complete one. We're going to be updating the comment schema a little bit. But before we do that, go back to dishes.js file. And in the dishes file, we will remove the comments from the dishes schema, because we're going to be storing the comments separately from the dishes in this version of our server. So that's how we will update the dishes model here. So we have removed the comments completely from the dishes model here. And going into the comments model, so we now see that we have the comment schema implemented here. But in addition, in the comments schema, we now need to explicitly point to the specific dish for which this comment is the corresponding comment. Now, this is where our Mongoose population and the way we store the object IDs comes to our rescue. So we will be updating the comment schema, saying we'll have the rating, the comment, and author here. In addition to the author, we will introduce one more field called as the dish here, which is of the type Mongoose schema types object ID. And so this will refer to the dish here, rather dish with a capital D here, dish here. So this would be a object reference to the dish model here. And so with this modification now, our comments will contain the rating field, the comment field, the author, which is again a reference to the corresponding user, and then the dish field, which is a reference to the corresponding dish here. So which means that we will now need to populate the comments with both the author and the dish field here. And once we have completed this, then we will say var comments Mongoose model, and we will call this as comment, and then this uses the comment schema that we have just defined here, and then we need to export this from here, the comments model from here. So now that we have introduced the comments model, then we will go ahead and then introduce a new router called as the comment router. So to introduce the comment router, let's go into the routes here and then create a new file named commentrouter.js. And in the commentrouter.js, let me copy a few things over from the dish router. So we will have these common here. So let me copy over these things from the and also while I am at it, let me just copy these also and up to that point, and then I'll update that a little bit later. So going into the comment router, we need all these parts. So we'll say express body parser, mongoose, authenticate, cars, and then we will be importing comments from models comments, and then we'll call this as the comment router, which is an express router here. And then we'll say comment router use body parser. And then this would now become comment router route. And now we need to go into the dish router and then remove all the parts that refers to the comments here. So let me just cut out this part, and then we will reuse these for our comment router. So all these are no longer needed in the dish router. So I'm going to remove all these from the dish router here. So let me cut that out. Everything related to the comments route from the dish router. And then we'll go into the comment router, and then let me go ahead and paste that into place here. And then we will edit that here. And then after this, we need to export the comment router. So we'll export the comment router from this. But of course, this code is not completely accurate. So we need to go ahead and fix this code here. So for this code, we now realize that this is not the dish router route. Instead, that should be the slash endpoint, because we're going to be mounting this in the slash comments endpoint here. So we'll say comment router, and then the options, cars with options, regress, which remains as such there. And then the get, cars, and then regress. And then this one will become comments find by ID, rec. Now, so this would be comments find and rec.query here. And then so when the comments is found, then at this point we will populate the author. Oh, I already have the populate here, so I'm just going to remove this comments.author, and then we'll just simply populate the author here. And then this would give us comments here, and then we'll say this can be simplified significantly. So the catch error is there anyway, so we'll say, so when the comments come in, we'll simply return, that should be, so if for the get, when we get the comments find rec.query, populate author here, and then we'll say then comments, and then we'll say res status code 200 set header, and then we'll return the comments from here, res.json comments from here. Now I'm not populating the dishes here because I don't explicitly need the dishes in my the way I use this information in my React client. I only need the dish ID, and the dish ID is already present there, and that is good enough for me to use this data in my React client. So I'm going to leave it as such there. I'm only going to populate the author information there because we need the full author information whenever we render a comment item in our React client. So the get will be updated like this here. For the post, we will say for the post cars with options, we'll say authenticate, verify user, regress next. Obviously, for a comment to be posted, you need the author to be a valid logged in user. Only then you will allow the user to post the comment, and then the comment itself comes in the body of the incoming request message. So we first will check the body to to make sure that the comment is included in the body here. So here I'm going to remove all these parts and then simplify it further, and then we'll implement this correctly there. So we'll say right at this point, we'll say if rec dot body not equal to null, so which means that there is a comment that is enclosed inside the body. Otherwise we will say so let me cut this and move this into the if part here, and then we'll edit that here. So if the body doesn't exist, then we will cause an error. So we'll say error new error comment not found in request body. So we'll raise this error here. Error status is 404, and then we'll say return next error. So let's handle the error part here. If the body doesn't contain the appropriate comment information. If it contains, then of course what we will do next is we'll say rec.body.author is rec.user ID. The reason why we are doing this is that we recall that if it is a registered user and the user has logged in, then the rec.user will contain the user information, and so I only need the ID of the currently logged in user. So we'll say rec.user ID, and then so we'll set the rec.body.author to rec.user ID. Now the verify user will automatically ensure that if you land at this point, then you would obviously have a user that was logged in correctly. Otherwise that would have already caused the problem there. So when you reach at this point, you would have a valid user that is already logged into the system in there. And then so this is where you would be able to now. So what we are doing is that the author field, we are explicitly setting it into the user's ID here, so that the body, the rec.body contains the remaining parts of the comment. So as you realize, the comment contains the rating, the comment itself, and the author and the dish field. So the remaining parts should have been filled by the user. The rating, the comment, and the dish information should already be filled into the body of the incoming request message, and the author part is left unfilled there, which we will explicitly insert at this point into the body here. So now the rec.body will contain the entire comment information. So at this point, I will, instead of doing this, we'll say comments create. Using the rec.body, we'll create the comments here, and then this will return the comment corresponding to the comment that we have just inserted here. Now once the comment is returned, then we should do comments find by ID. Now the reason we need to do this is because we need to populate the author information here. So we'll say find by ID comments.id, and then we'll populate the author information into the comment itself, and then we'll say then comment. Now obviously here you would find that the comment will exist because we just inserted that comment into place there. So here we will simply return res status code is 200, res set header is content type application JSON, and the comment itself will say rest.json and then return the comment at this point. So this is the way we will handle the insertion of a new comment into our client side here. For the put, as you realize, you won't be able to do a put on the /comments endpoint. So we'll say put operation not supported on /comments endpoint. That's the point. That's the message that you'll return. So status code is 403 and then put operation not supported on comments. Now, when you do a delete, here, so when we do a delete, we simply, let me just cut these out from here, and then we'll say comments remove with an empty. So when you do a delete on the /comments endpoint, you will remove all the comments from your system. So this is a very dangerous operation, and so you should not be doing this normally. So we'll only allow the admin to perform such an operation. So we'll remove all the comments from there, and then so when you get the response, then we'll say res status code 200. So let me just copy these parts here and then comment, paste it in here. So we'll say comments remove, then response res status code 200 application JSON, and then res.json response here. So that's how we handle the deletion, delete operation on the /comments endpoint. Now the next route is the comment router. So here we'll say comment router route, and the endpoint here would be the /comment ID. /comment ID. And so here the options will remain as such. And then for the get on the comment router, for the get we'll say comments find by ID rec params. This would be comment ID. And so once we find the specific comment, then we will populate just the author from there. And then once you populate the author, then we'll say then comment. Now all this part is unnecessary here, so I'm just going to delete the part, and then this is also not the appropriate thing here. So let me re-indent code. So we'll say for the get comments find by ID, then populate the author, then comment, res status code is 200, set header, and then the rest.json, we will be simply returning the comments here. So we'll be returning the comment at this point, res.json comment. We'll find the specific comment and then return that comment. For the post, For the post operation, as you realize, the post operation is not allowed on comments, comment ID. So that's the message that we will send back. Post operation not supported on comments/comment ID. So that's the message we'll say. For the put, now for the put, we'll say comments find by ID rec params comment ID. So we'll find the comment there, and then comment. So for the put, so we'll find the comment there, and then we'll say for the comment. So if we find the comment, if the comment is not null, if the comment is not null, then we'll also check if comment.author, if not, comment.author equals rec.user ID. So we are cross-checking to make sure that the comments author is the same as the current user. Only the current user who is logged in, if the user is the same as the comments author, then the user will be allowed to update. So that's the first thing that we will check. So comments, then comments author equal to rec.user ID. If not, then you'll say you are not authorized to update this comment, as you see rec.403, and then return next error here. So we'll create the error there. Then after this, then we'll say rec.body.author rec.user ID. That's important. Now these two are not necessary here because we are directly saving the comment, and then we'll say comments.find by ID and update, and rec.params.comment ID. So we'll find that specific comment because we have already been supplied the comment ID. So we'll do comments find by ID rec.params.comment ID, and then we'll say then comment. And when you supply the rec.params.comment ID, we'll have to explicitly supply the second parameter, which is what we want to change. So we'll say $set rec.body. So the second parameter essentially tells you which part you're changing. Now, since we have been supplied the body containing the updated comment, we are just going to update the entire comment itself. And then the other part we'll ask for is new true. So this will ensure that the updated comment will be returned in the then of this call to the comments find by ID and update. So we'll say then comments, and when that comment is returned, then we'll say comments find by ID comment underscore ID, then populate the author there, we'll populate the author there, and then we'll say then comment. So you see that we'll obtain the comment and then return the comment at this point here. So that's how we will be updating the comment. So this is the situation where the comment is not null. So this if statement for the comment is not null. So if the else if part, now this is not applicable, so we'll say else error, the error in this case. So if the comment is null, that means that we did not find the comment in there, so you cannot modify a non-existent comment. So we'll say new error comment rec params.comment id not found, and then we'll return the error there. So that's how we will handle the put part of our comment here. And then finally the delete. For the delete, again, we'll have to first find comments, find by ID, rec params comment ID, and then comment. So we'll look for the comment. So we'll first check if comment is not equal to null. That's important to check here. And then the next part we will check for is if the comment.author equals rec.user underscore ID. So if we make sure that this user that is trying to delete this comment is exactly the same user that inserted the comment in the first place. If not, so if this is the situation, then you'll say you are not authorized to delete this comment and then return the status there. And then down below here, we'll say comments find by ID and remove here. So we'll say comments find by ID and remove rec params comments ID. Then we'll get some response from the comment. So at this point, we'll simply say res.status code. So we'll say comments find by ID and remove, then response. If it is correctly removed, we'll say 200 and then res.json response here. And we'll also catch the error at this point. So let me just copy that here, and then we'll include the catch of the error at this point. So that's the first thing that we'll check. We'll ensure that the comment is not equal to null. Otherwise, so this is the else part. Okay, so this is the else part of the if. Else, error, new comment, rec params comment ID not found, and then 404, and send the else part for this. And then the then part will handle appropriately. So this is the changes that we make for the comment router here. So we are handling the get, put, post, and delete for the /comments endpoint, /comments /comment ID endpoint. So once we have completed this, then we need to include this into the app.js file. So we'll go into the app.js file, and then we will get, we'll say var comment router require routes.comment router. So we have the comment router here, and then we'll go down into the app.js file down below here, and then we will say app use /comments comment router here. That's it. So now my comment router is ready. So let's go ahead and save all the changes. And then our server is now updated in order to handle all the requests from our React client here. Now, if you want to do the alternative way, that is, you have your comments as subdocuments of your dish, and then you want to handle that, then you will need to update the React client to be able to use the comments from within each dish appropriately. That will be left as an exercise for you. Think about how you would design your React client such that it works very well with the earlier version of the server, which had the comments as subdocuments of your dishes themselves. Now that will be an interesting way of implementing it. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than the way we implemented the React client, where we kept the comments independent of the dishes. But then the additional work is then the responsibility of the client side, because you need to select the appropriate comments when you're showing a specific dish. You need to select the comments from all the comments here. So that's one additional work that our React client does because of the fact that we separated the comments from the dishes themselves. Similarly, if you can redesign your Angular client to be able to deal with the situation where the comments are kept independent of your dishes. Now, so these are all exercises that you can do in order to see how you can extend your client applications to handle any kind of server, the two different kinds of servers there. So with this, we complete the update to our server here. So with this, we have updated everything on the server side. So let's save all the changes on the server side. So now our server is all ready to handle the incoming requests from our React client. With this, we complete this exercise. In this exercise, we have now prepared our Express server to handle incoming requests from our React client. In the next exercise, we're going to look at React client in more detail to understand how it is communicating with this Express server. This is a good time for you to do a Git commit with the message integrating client and server.